a happy person projects happy energy, and you generate it. It's all about you. It's not like people say, if good things happen to me, I'll be happy. They say, no, if you're happy, good things will happen to you. In that sense, it's
so the happiness, number one, makes your life more meaningful, enriches your life. It's healthier. I'm sure there's a lot of medical evidence that people who are happy are healthier. It helps to bring out positive emotions. It makes you get along with other people much more successfully than without happiness. And it's the cure for a lot of different emotional ailments.
Look at the antithesis, anxiety.
Right.
And what it does to health.
But what some people are going to say, rabbis, you're talking in theory, but when your life is really miserable, when someone who you love is very ill and they're on the verge of dying, and all the tsaros, the misfortunes that people experience, it's easy for us to say because thank God we don't have any problems. Or we
speak for yourself.
You know the story of Reb Zusha, the famous Hasidic master. Someone came to his teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich, the second Hasidic leader, and said, I heard it says in the Talmud that a person should accept suffering the same way they accept good things with the same joy. I can't understand that. I can't accept that. Explain it to me. And he said, go to my student Zusha. Zusha lived at the outskirts of town in a broken down shack. He comes in, he sees poverty, he sees people dressed in rags, no furniture, and he sees a man with a smile on his face, and he says, what can I do for you? He says, well, your teacher sent me to you to ask you the question, how could you accept misfortune or difficulties in life with joy? He says, I'm surprised that he sent you to me because I never experienced anything negative in my life.
Right, exactly.
So some people could be at that level, but most of us are not at that level. Most people go through real difficulties in every imaginable way, and you just have to look now. On my internet, there's just you get notices of people who are asking for help, financial help, because their daughter is dying, and this one broke bones. I mean, and most of those stories are true. And of course, you'd like to give everyone donations for all this. You realize there's so much misery in the world. How do we reconcile that with everything we're saying about happiness? I have a hard time finding
it's a $1 million question. It's easy to talk about until it happened. Like the famous story where a guy came to his teacher and asked him, "How could you be happy when there's sad things?" And he gave him all the explanations. It's hidden good, and then God has deeper reasons. And then finally, he told him, long story short, that he suffered a tragedy. He says, you can start dancing, so he fainted instead of dancing. When it happens to you.
Right,
so,
it's easy to talk about in theory, but in practice it's...
Well, I think one of the most powerful lessons we can take from the Jewish people, and I've had this question asked to me many times, Jews have suffered greatly, maybe more than any people. Going back, talking about almost the beginning of our history, the Egyptian exile, and then we had to deal with the Assyrians, and we had to deal with the Babylonians and the Romans and you name it, Spanish. I mean, there wasn't a time, of course, the Holocaust. And yet you see Jews as a whole have laughter, smiling, happiness. You see I remember my grandmother suffered greatly, but she always had that smile on her face. And that's not theory. How did they, I've seen people gone through tragedies, and I'm not saying they cry more than anybody, but there's something that they hold on to that seems to give them that extra strength. I mean, Viktor Frankl, in his Man's Search for Meaning, talked about meaning, purpose, which doesn't mean you suffer less. It just means you have more resources to hold on to, so it's not going to completely destroy you. And that, there's no question, that is the trick. When somebody suffers, you can't just tell them, hey, be happy. Sometimes you just have to hold their hand and be empathetic and be with them. And it's going to ultimately come down to digging and finding greater strengths. And that's where the real happiness is real discovered. I mean, it's easy to be happy when, as you said, everything is going well. Can you be happy when things are challenging?
Right. People who have genuine happiness when things do go well are much better equipped to deal with tragedy, God forbid, if it happens, because they have a different perspective on life.
I once heard that one of the reasons that we break a glass under the chuppah, that high moment of the greatest happiness and joy, why do you have to be reminded of destruction? There are plenty of other times you can remember. And I once heard, I don't remember who said it, but I thought it was a very powerful insight, that when you remember those that are broken in times of your great happiness, so when you go through something that is a break, you too will not be 100%, it'll be the joy that still remains. In other words, it's not, always be humble in your happiness and your joy, and as well as in your sadness, because sadness could also become overcome. The sadness controls you instead of you recognizing that there's a deeper element to it. But again, it's easier said than done. You know the story, what's the story with the two brothers, Elimelech and Zusha, with the prison?
Yeah.
Might as well tell it. So they were in prison, and one of them was very sad, and his brother said to him, "Why are you sad?" He says, "Because it's now weeks that I can't make a blessing, because in the cell, in the prison, there's the bathroom, and now that I make a blessing where there's a bathroom." So his brother said to him, "What do you mean? That you're also fulfilling God's mitzvah. He's telling you not to make a blessing in a time." So he says, "You're right." He gets up and starts dancing, and the whole prison, all the inmates are dancing. Everybody's dancing. The guard, the angry guard, comes running. He says, "Why is everybody dancing?" They say, "The Jew is dancing, so we're also dancing." "Why is he dancing?" "Something to do with the pail in his room." So he says, "Okay, I'll show you," and he pulls out the pail, and then of course he can make the blessing. It's a
classic story, and it's a very powerful one, because it shows that there's no such thing as a place or a time or a situation in which you can't have a relationship with God.
Right. Exactly. And that means even in the darkest moments, there's light. There's some light, and it doesn't take away the sadness, but it gives you the hope that they tell. I don't know if it was the Bluzhin or one of the Rebbes. He was during the Holocaust. He was in one of the camps and had some of his Hasidim, some of his followers. And these camps, they weren't just murder camps. They were also they were like beasts. They dehumanized the Jews, and so they had this. The commander there had this particular cruel game that he played. He had the Jews dig these wide trenches, and said, "Okay, they start playing music. Whoever jumps over the trench lives. Whoever doesn't gets shot right on the spot." So one of the Chassidim, one of the disciples of his Rebbe says, "Enough is enough of this misery. Let's just allow ourselves to be killed, go back to God in heaven." And the Rebbe said, "No, as long as you're alive, you have to fight. You never know God's mysterious plans." So anyway, the game, so to speak, begins. And in the havoc and the mayhem, nobody knows who survived, who didn't survive. A few weeks later, they were liberated. And lo and behold, both the Rebbe and his chassid survived. They meet. And they were both surprised to see each other. And the chassid says to his Rebbe, he says, "You're not a young man, how did you jump over the trench?" He says, "I closed my eyes and I held on to the kapota, to the coattails of my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and the generations, and it gave me the strength to jump." And he said to the chassid, "You're also not a young man. How did you jump?" He says, "I held on to your coattails." So the idea that we're not alone and that we have inner strengths is again, the word happiness maybe has to be used with discretion, but it still gives you the strength to overcome, that there's no challenge that cannot be overcome.
Right. Happiness can only be achieved if a person has a belief in God, number one, and has a belief that God is aware of everything that goes on in our lives, and that God loves us and cares for us, and ultimately will do everything in His power to make our lives, to correct all the bad things. And that's our belief in the Messianic age and the coming of Mashiach. And it's interesting, the word Mashiach has the same letters as the word for rejoicing. Yismach, he will rejoice. Or Yisamach, he will make others rejoice. Because the ultimate goal is his happiness, true happiness, authentic happiness. The psalmist says, "Oz yimale schayk pinu," then our mouths will be filled with laughter. Only then, only in the Messianic age. Today we can be happy, but our happiness is not going to be complete until God's presence will be fully revealed. As long as God is hiding behind a barrier, that's the antithesis of joy. Joy is when you break out of barriers. As soon as God breaks out of the barrier that He imposed, which we call galut, exile, then the joy will be so incredible And how do we prepare for that? By being happy.
Yeah. Look, another way of putting it, what you're saying is, Galut exile is like displacement. When you're displaced, there's no way you could be happy. It's when you know you belong, a seamlessness. Like when Mashiach comes, there'll be a seamless. You know this is exactly where you need to be. Without that real seamlessness, you never could be a happy person, because there's always, maybe subconsciously, a sense, I'm not really where I belong, I'm not doing what I should be doing. That idea, if people knew today exactly that I know what I need to be doing right now is what is the purpose of my life, there's no greater source for happiness. As long as you don't know that, you're going to be, going back to what we spoke, you're going to be constantly groping for something that will fill that void.
I think one of the causes of anxiety, it could be many causes, but one of the causes, I think, is the fact that we have a soul. Whether we recognize it or not, we all have a soul. The soul wants to go in this direction. We're going in the other direction. And the soul says, I have a purpose. I want you to take me in the right direction. And you're going off in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So it has anxiety that it's not going to be able to fulfill its mission in this world. That's why the soul came down, to fulfill a mission. So what happens? The conscious mind doesn't understand what the soul wants. So the conscious mind thinks it wants entertainment, wants some pleasure, physical pleasure, sensual pleasure.
Right.
There's a famous parable in the Midrash about the princess who falls in love with the gardener, and they elope. And the gardener loves her, and he provides her with potatoes and carrots and onions and turnips and what have you, and she's not happy because she missed the life of a princess in the palace.
Right.
And he says to her, my dear, my love, why are you so unhappy? I'm giving you everything, everything that I value. He says, that's the problem. It's what you value. You don't know what I value.
Right.
And the soul feels that same way, and it causes us to be unhappy and anxious. So depression and anxiety, all these emotional problems that I think are being reported now more than ever before. I think if you go back 200 years, you're not going to find that many shrinks dealing with anxiety and depression.
I totally agree. I mean, I once read a speech delivered by the head of the U.S. Navy. He was a Jew. His name was, his name.
Rickover, Admiral Rickover?
Adam Rickover. Yeah, Adam Rickover. He became a 4-star, in the Navy, 4 stars like the highest level. He was, I think he escaped Europe before the war.
He was behind, I think, the
naval, they call him the nuclear naval,
yeah.
the nuclear navy he created.
Yeah.
But he gave an interesting talk. I found it fascinating. He says, it was in 1955. He was comparing 1855 to 1955, and he said that in 1855, 90% of energy generated in the world was through human effort, man labor. In 1955, 90% of energy is generated through machines. So he said 2 things happened as a result. First of all, wealth exploded, because now you can press a button and exponentially, then you needed to work in the field or whatever it may be. And the second thing, the birth of leisure, free time. Because you don't need to spend 8 hours in the hot sun getting a bushel of potatoes to eat. And that leisure, but he didn't focus a lot on the leisure. I said to myself, exactly, what happened to all that free time? How did we fill it?
No one has free time nowadays. Because they're pursuing happiness, and it's elusive.
But it's free time, and it's not based on real survival, so it's free time, and what are we doing with it? We're squandering it. Right. Totally. And how could that, there's no way. I think another thing, I remember the Lubavitcher Rebbe saying, that the human nature is to produce. Adam la'om yoval. You have to produce. If you're not producing, you cannot be happy. It's like you're not living up to who you are. It's like a musician who's not allowed to play music, or anyone else with a talent. And the fact that we are, pursuing these extracurricular activities that we don't need, and not really living up to who we truly are, has to be a tremendous source of unhappiness, and therefore, again, filling it with all kinds of other superficial stuff.